But the first New World songbird, I think, was appropriate too. It was our robin. In those days, everyone was singing that song about the poor little robin, remember? When we reached my home in Maryland, the woodlands were one great carpet of wildflowers, and these woodland flowers were of great interest to him because most of the woodland flowers are not found in Europe. Certainly the blue phlox, the woodland phlox, is not found in Europe. Neither are the trilliums or the jack-in-the-pulpit or the Dutchman's breeches. On the other hand, most of the roadside flowers are the same because most of our roadside flowers have been introduced from the Old World. The redbud, we met in full bloom as we went down the Appalachian ridges. It was just the most wonderful time to be making this trip. It was the time of the great arrival of so many birds from the south. The scarlet tanagers were just coming northward, and the rose-breasted grosbeaks arriving from the tropics. We were breasting the full tide of spring migration. We're going to go rather quickly on that first part of the journey, but I don't suppose we saw our first red-headed woodpeckers until we almost reached Great Smoky Park. But in this one great national park, we have 130 species of trees, so I think the real show there is put on by the trees. In all of Europe, they have only 81 species of native trees. Now, the reason for that is that during the Ice Age, their trees were eliminated. Their mountains go from east to west, the Alps and the Pyrenees. Their trees disappeared. They couldn't retreat, whereas our mountains go north and south, and our trees, you might say, migrated during the Ice Age. That's why we have more. But to see trees like the palms and the cypress trees, others that we think of as being quite tropical, we have to go into Florida. And here at Wakulla, this is cypress, but here's Wakulla Springs. In Wakulla Springs, we found not only these interesting new plant forms, but also birds which represented New World families. We left the Texas coast, went into Mexico, and we had quite a problem at the border because, as you notice, we have the parabolic reflector on the roof of the car. The customs officials, the Mexican officials, asked what that was, and Fisher just couldn't resist telling them it was a flying saucer. Well, that gummed things up for about 2 hours, but we finally did get down to Elitla, this wonderful Aztec village where Irby Davis makes his Christmas census every year. This is the place where it's possible to see more birds in one day than any other spot in the, well, I think in either North or Central America. 250 kinds in one day. Now, we saw parrots of 4 or 5 sorts here, motmots, toucanets. The man in the white shirt is Bob Newman, who's quite an authority on this part of Mexico, and the man who looks like the explorer is Fisher. We're up amongst the tree ferns in the cloud forest, but really that's the subject of another screen tour, another film, which I'll bring some future year to Detroit. But to get into Mexico and to return, we had to cross, of course, the Rio Grande, and in 1953, the Rio Grande wasn't very grand. This was it. Fisher had heard a lot about the Rio Grande. On the other hand, other rivers like the Chipola and the Apalachicola, rivers he'd never heard about, were great torrents, mighty streams. This was the Rio Grande. But about several hundred miles up from the sea in the Big Bend, there was quite a bit of water, and Fisher made the comment that our western rivers seem to be larger where they start than where they end. I think that's rather true. But in this Big Bend country, we're really in the west ornithologically. We no longer see the red-shouldered hawk. Instead, we see the Swainson's hawk, this wonderful hawk of the deserts and the prairies. Beautiful bird, which you wouldn't expect to find here. There is one spot in the Big Bend along the river, Santa Elena Canyon, where you can actually stand in Texas, have the soil of Texas under your feet, look up and see Mexico 1,000 feet over your head. That's Chihuahua, right opposite. The cliffs are so undercut that Mexico is right overhead. It was desperately dry during this part of our journey. In fact, all through Texas that particular year. Still, we did see many birds and many mammals too, because these desert creatures are very well adapted to the extremes of climate that they must endure. Every time I've driven through western Texas, I've seen pronghorns, antelopes, particularly around towns like Alpine, Marathon. I suppose they've been reintroduced there, but it is part of the original range of this animal. This is prairie, but western Texas does have both the prairie and the desert. But to see the real desert, you have to go still farther west, the desert that we see in the travel posters. Around Tucson, we find the saguaros, standing 30 or 40 feet tall, even 50 feet tall at times. Wonderful plants which have several kinds of birds nesting in them in the woodpecker holes. This Sonoran desert in Arizona is not a barren desert by any means. It's a living desert. And I think Walt Disney used a very good term when he applied the term living desert to his film. Incidentally, we awarded Walt Disney the Audubon Medal a month ago for his True Adventure series and for the contribution to conservation through that series. He's done a magnificent job, and as you know, much of the film footage has been taken by Audubon screen tour photographers, including your own Tom Hadley. The mule deer, you wonder, when you see it here, you wonder how this animal can find enough to eat, where everything seems to carry prickers and to carry thorns, needles and daggers. Still, I suppose the most important thing is water. Now, these animals are not water-cooled engines as we are. They can't drink Coca-Colas and wander about in the noonday sun. They hide mostly during the day and come out at night, and the time to see them is around the water holes. The time is at night. There is a very wonderful little water hole near the Tucson Desert Museum where they have a bird blind, photographic blind, little pilot light. When the animals come to drink, you throw on the bright floodlights and take their pictures. This mule deer, however, doesn't like the sound of my camera. See, I have a Cine Special, and it sounds very much like a rattlesnake. He's heard that sound before. He doesn't like it. He's had just about enough, and away he goes. This is a little spike buck. Usually when I push the button, the animal would jump immediately. So for every shot I'm showing, perhaps I started to take 10. On the other hand, the little fawns were more trusting. They didn't seem to know the rattlesnake noise. But I was surprised that the peccaries, the little wild pigs, were frightened. I thought that pigs ignored snakes, but apparently they didn't like the sound either. But I did get this one portrait of an old boar colored peccary, but even he doesn't like the sound. On the other hand, the little animals that came about in the daytime, animals like the antelope ground squirrel, were less nervous. I suppose it's because rattlesnakes go about at night mostly. I'm not going to show all the 14 birds that I photographed here, but the desert sparrow, I think, is certainly one of the most attractive of all the sparrows, perhaps the most attractive sparrow in the country. While one bird drank, the other birds would wait their turns. The house finch looks very much like the purple finches that come through on migration or that winter here about Detroit. And then there were the little Gambel's quail, the desert quail that seemed to be finding plenty to eat in the sands. They were picking about in the sands. I suppose there must be tremendous numbers of seeds just lying, waiting for the rains to bring them to life. But these quail were very nervous. The least little sound would send them running, least little movement. I don't suppose that a Gila monster, this big lizard, could catch a quail. I think it's probably too large and too slow. This is our only poisonous lizard, the only venomous lizard. Actually, so many people have been trying to make friends, I should say make pets of these big lizards lately, that the state of Arizona has had to pass protective legislation to keep the stock from being too much depleted. Actually, though, we don't like to see even our poisonous creatures completely exterminated, because after all, they are the end product of 1 billion years of evolution. And once man has destroyed a thing, he can never replace it. Southern Arizona is the place for the naturalist, I'm sure, but on the other hand, I think the northern part of the state has a greater interest to the student of human history, or perhaps I should say prehistory, because it is here that we find the old dwellings of the cliff dwellers, the old people that disappeared about the time the Navajos and the Apaches came down from the north. I told James Fisher that this White House in the Canyon de Chelly was actually older than that castle that he showed me near Northamptonshire in England, near his home. This was an Arizona castle, an ancient one, but we found Indians, modern Indians, living here too. The Navajos, who build their traditional hogans, which look rather like defensive pillboxes. And these Indians speak in hushed tones of the old people who disappeared when they came. But I think the Hopis in this village are probably directly descended from the old people. Actually, this town was here when Coronado's men came up out of Mexico looking for the 7 cities that were paved with gold. They didn't find the gold, of course, and they were disappointed. They turned westward, and in due time they came to the Grand Canyon, and they were bitterly disappointed because they couldn't cross it. Fisher did not say a word for the first 10 minutes when he saw the canyon. And then I noticed that he seemed to be wiping his forehead with his handkerchief, but I noticed that he was actually wiping tears from his eyes, actually dabbing tears from his eyes. Later, he told me that this was the greatest visual shock he'd ever had in his life. He is a geologist. He knew that he was seeing half of the history of the world exposed before his eyes, 500 million years of geologic history. He certainly could interpret what he saw. He was not like some tourists who just cannot comprehend and therefore are left a little bit cold by the canyon. It is certainly one of the world's great wonders, an unbelievable, staggering thing. Farther west around the Gulf, in Louisiana, we came to Bird City, which was a wonderful area. Some of you may know this spot, but it might best be described as an artificial heron colony. It's one of the great ornithological spectacles of our country. Many years ago, McElhenney, who made the Tabasco sauce that we use on our tables, started with 8 young birds, 8 young snowy egrets just out of the egg, raised them by hand in a big flying cage, and at the end of the season he took the cage down, they migrated, they came back, and over a period of years he built this into a colony of something like 25,000 pairs. Now, the older McElhenney is gone, but his grandson is very keen on birds. He puts out the sticks for them and keeps these platforms up, and it's quite a sight. Something is happening almost all the time in a heron colony. Very often, though, when a young one slips and falls, that means the end of it. It dies of starvation because its parents do not feed the young one in the water. Herons go by location more than anything else. They don't seem to have sense enough to look down in the water for their young ones. So old Albert the alligator is usually down there hoping that a young one will fall in. This one really is Alberta. Albert would eat them up, I know he would. I just couldn't resist this very pleasant domestic scene and must have taken 300 feet of film just on this. The National Audubon Society has many sanctuaries, many refuges around the Gulf Coast between Florida and Texas. And probably the most interesting one is this island, Lydia Ann, not far from Corpus Christi. We visited Lydia Ann about 2 weeks after the storms had swept this island, and most of the birds had been destroyed. The eggs had, the young, except for these young reddish egrets, very loose-feathered. Now, that's Junior on the left, rather. He's hungry, asking his mother for something to eat. I think that's his mother, although she certainly doesn't act like it. I think we can thank the National Audubon Society for the reddish egret because the society has protected every known colony for many years along the Texas coast until this bird now is as common as it was originally. Eventually, I suppose the bird will again be as common too in Florida. Now, this is a bird I'd never expect to find around Detroit because it's strictly a saltwater bird. But if you were to find a bird that looked like this, it would very likely be a Caspian tern. Caspian tern looks very similar. But as I said before, birds do have wings, and that's what makes this one of the really great hobbies of the world, this hobby of bird watching. That's why men like Ralph O'Reilly and others find so much fun in it. I'd never expect to find a laughing gull around the Great Lakes, but I have on 2 occasions seen laughing gulls on the Great Lakes, once on Lake Erie, once on Lake Michigan. Anything is possible. These are also saltwater. Now we're going to leave the saltwater again and cross California to Yosemite, which is the great garden spot, I think, of our West. Probably the most beautiful valley in the world. When a Californian tells us that his state has the highest waterfalls in the country and the lowest desert in the country, the highest mountain, largest lettuce field, largest oranges, largest vineyard, he's not stretching it. He's usually stating simple fact. California is certainly the wonder state of all the 48 states, although I suppose that Michigan is number 2. But I think we'd all agree that California does have the greatest variety. Certainly the big trees, the sequoias, are not only the largest living things on earth, but very likely the oldest. Many of these trees have been here for 2,000 years or more before the time of Christ, and I suspect the grizzly giant, 1 or 2 of the really big ones, must be even 4,000 years old or very close to it. James Fisher did want to drive through that tree he'd read about. Now, we don't do this sort of thing to our trees in the national parks today. This was done back in the 80s when we were a little more disrespectful about our natural wonders. Even the lesser trees, the sugar pines and the others, are so incredible that you have to stop and think a while about them. This one, however, is a sequoia, and the man showing Fisher about, showing his favorite trees, is Don McHenry, the park naturalist. All through the groves, there were wonderful white-headed woodpeckers, and I think this certainly is my favorite woodpecker in the Pacific states, just perhaps as my favorite woodpecker here is the redhead. Redhead is a beautiful bird. I think this is my favorite in the West. In its own way, it's just as attractive, I think, as the redhead. I was quite pleased that the first bears, which I was able to show Fisher, were not panhandling bears or beggar bears, but this wild mother bear and her 3 cubs. Usually when you find a wild mother with cubs, she does one of 2 things. She either goes away from you in a hurry or comes towards you in a hurry. We didn't know what this one was going to do. It was a little uncertain, but she finally sent her young to the tall timber, sending them scooting. Now, the brown bear and the black bear are not distinct species, but color phases of the same animal. We're going to drop over the top of the Sierras now to the northeastern side, to the desert side, where we will briefly visit one of the great federal duck refuges, the Tule-Klamath Refuge, which is supported quite largely by the sale of the $2 duck stamp to sportsmen. Now, this is a wonderful area that is right within sight of that volcanic cone, Mount Shasta, and it is a duck refuge dedicated to ducks, but all birds benefit, not just the ducks, because the important thing is a place to live. That's almost more important than anything else. It's a place to live. Because of the federal refuge program, there are thousands more black-necked stilts in the world today than there were, thousands of more avocets. All birds benefit, not just the ducks, which have the immediate appeal to the sportsman. And I'm sure there must be many thousands more western grebes in the world today, too, because of the refuges. Junior is going for a ride on his mother's back. I was quite interested at the time of our visit that the little ruddy ducks, this was the middle of June, the little ruddies were still going through their courtship display, that wonderful display which is so interesting. They cock their tails like house wrens, and their bills are bluer at this time of year, and they thump their bills on their chests and make all sorts of noises, all of which is supposed to be very appealing to other ruddy ducks, I suppose. Now, the interesting thing is that most ducks, when they've won the female, forget about her. She takes care of the family. They ignore her and sulk about amongst the reeds and molt their feathers, but the ruddy keeps this up right through the time the young hatch. He's very much more gallant. I suppose there's some sort of a moral here. Well, when we photographed this little burrowing owl, the temperature must have been at least 105 degrees, and Fisher said he didn't see how we Americans could stand our climate. And I said, well, just wait, we have all sorts of climates. So he was so pleased the next day when we climbed to Crater Lake and saw snowdrifts 10 to 20 feet deep. This was the 16th of June, which was the beginning of the tourist season. Still, the snow was very deep on the high mountains. In fact, the snow gauge at the rim showed 30 feet. Fisher was, again, quite staggered by what he saw, and he said, if I can remember his exact words, that our West seems to be the theater of these staggering examples of geologic luck. I think that's the way he put it. He called this the Great Fire Wonder. And I asked him what he meant by that, and he said because this lake was formed by the collapse of an extinct volcano. 5,000 years ago, this volcano blew up, the mountain collapsed, and now in its deep caldera lies the deepest lake in the world, perhaps the bluest lake. Word for it. Now, around the rim there were Canada jays like this, and also the Clark's nutcrackers, too, like this bird. They were begging peanuts from the tourists, almost stealing the show from the blue lake itself. Now, the Clark's nutcracker was named after Clark of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Clark's crow, they called it in the old days. All through this area, in the Cascades, the drifts were melting and the flowers were coming forth. They were like great flower gardens. The Indian paintbrush. And then there was Lewis's monkey flower, named after Lewis of the Lewis and Clark expedition. He was a good botanist. And the bear grass, wonderful tall plant, and the avalanche lily, which looks very much like the white adder's tongue that we sometimes see in Michigan in the spring. But the avalanche lilies were much better around Rainier when I came by in August. Some miles below the city of Portland, as we were going towards the coast, we came to an area where every tree on the horizon was dead. Every tree was dead. And we drove through this depressing landscape for mile after mile after mile. I had read of this. This was the great Tillamook burn, where some 20-odd years before, a great fire had swept through and in about 3 days' time had destroyed 500 square miles of timber. 500 square miles. Now that was a great economic catastrophe, as you know, because at the time, that was as much timber as the whole United States used in a year of that fire. Many of those trees were primeval trees, 200 feet tall or more, like these, which we photographed farther north on the peninsula, on the Olympic Peninsula. They were Douglas firs, Sitka spruce. It's becoming harder and harder to find primeval areas outside of the national parks. The tallest tree in England today is a Douglas fir, 180 feet tall, at Powis Castle, a tree planted from seed which David Douglas, the Scotsman, brought over. Olympic Park must have tens of thousands of trees over 200 feet tall, and I hope this wonderful park never knows the axe, because it would be a crime against future generations if we were allowed that to happen. This great, wonderful park belongs to all of us, every one of us, and not just to a few men to make a profit from. In the long run, it's going to have far more recreational value in dollars and cents than the immediate timber return. Now, at this point, we're going to leave the car in Seattle, and we're going to fly to Alaska. At this point, we've been joined by two friends, Dr. Finnur Gudmundsson of Iceland, the director of the Icelandic Museum, and Bill Cottrell, a librarian at Harvard University, both good birdmen. But I was pleased to see this wonderful country, Alaska, before it has changed too much. In fact, I'd never seen rivers like this before. This was the plane that we took to the town of Old Chivak, a plane that would take just 1,000 pounds. Well, Gudmundsson, as you can see on the left, is an enormous man, and we took just gasoline enough to get us out there. And then our pilot hoped to pick up gasoline to make the return journey from the local Eskimos. When the plane went back to Bethel, we looked after it rather soberly, because we knew that if the fogs came in off Bering Sea, we could be here for as much as a month. We had food for just about 1 week. But it was a very wonderful week, and almost a heat wave for Alaska, all except one very cold day, which I'll tell about later. And it was like a great flower garden. Here was the cotton grass, which looks very much like the cotton grass we find farther north in Michigan, in cold bogs, and in Ontario. And then there was this little bunchberry, not the bunchberry that we are familiar with, but Cornus vesica, which I'd seen in Sweden, I'd seen it in Newfoundland. And this little blackberry, Rubus chemimoris, I'd seen in Newfoundland and in Scotland and in Sweden. Many of the flowers here were circumpolar. By that I mean found around the top of the world, around the North Pole. The birch trees were just about 3 inches tall, tiny little things. I suppose you could call them trees. They are woody. The willows were even smaller. They were just 1 inch tall. Behind the old church was the abandoned Eskimo cemetery. I suppose it isn't really abandoned because the dead Eskimos still live here, but because of the permafrost, they can't dig below the surface, and they're in these canvas-covered affairs, which we could see for miles across the tundra. It caught the eye at a great distance. The duck under the cross is an old squaw duck, and the big bird on the left is a Pacific godwit, a bird which comes in from Siberia. It's one of the Asiatics that lives in this part of Alaska. Peterson, and he's bringing up his salmon nets. His brother Charlie Peterson was the Eskimo, the chief in the town of New Chivak. I suppose he's really a Svenskimo, I don't know. But his assistant, Jack Paniak, is showing us the big king salmon they caught. Wonderful big fish. The others are dog salmon. We ate several of the dog salmon, but most of those were destined for the drying rack, where they would eventually be used to feed the sledge dogs. They have quite a job feeding the sledge dogs during the long months. We passed two men in their kayaks, and it was quite interesting to notice their dress. We stopped at the fish camp down river farther, and I asked this old lady and her two daughters if they would pose for me. The girl on the right thought she shouldn't just stand there. She thought she ought to do something. So she does something. Very graceful, isn't it? I suppose she thought this was going to be used in Hollywood. I don't know. But now the old lady's going to show how they walk across the tundra on those long treks they make. The Eskimos are great at pantomime, great at acting. Great actors. The men were elsewhere, all except this man. He was a deaf mute. He'd been left behind. He could not speak, could not talk, but he wanted to talk very much. And when I asked him about that walrus tusk on the stick, what that was for, he explained in some of the most beautiful sign language I've ever seen. He said, when you need mucklucks for your feet in winter, when wet weather gets cold, then you take the kayak, paddle it down that way, down to Hooper Bay where the seals haul out. He was very eloquent, and he didn't need words. This mud doesn't either. A friend of mine who is a military geologist tells me that this is some of the most interesting mud she knows about. She says there's only one other place you find mud formed in quite the same manner, and that's along the Platte River. Now, I don't have time to go into that. In fact, I don't quite understand it thoroughly, but we had to wade through that stuff every time we went downriver at low tide to the Fish and Wildlife Base Camp. This is the greatest goose nursery in the New World, and undoubtedly greater than even those on the Siberian deltas. Not only geese were here, but ducks and loons, swans, passed, but I never did find the nests of the swans, but there were many swans. And once when I had my bell and howl mounted on the camera gun, one of the swans peeled off, and I got this picture at 64 frames. Sometime I'm going to get one of the 128 frame jobs and slow things down still more. Jack caught a baby sandhill crane, and we posed the two of them for the pictures. This was the most wonderful time of the year to be on the tundra because it was the week of the great hatch when every bird was hatching out young. The flowers were at their best. It was just a glorious time. The commonest gull was a surprise, not the familiar herring gull or one of the ones that we knew very well, but this one, the Sabin's gull, a bird which I'd seen only once before in my life, and that was off the coast of California in migration. Fisher had seen this bird only once before in his life, and that was in Spitsbergen, north of Norway. But here they seem to fit the same niche that the laughing gull does on the coast or that the Franklin's gull does on the prairies. Watch this bird dive bomb Mr. Fisher now. Now that's slowed down. It's much more terrifying when they're coming full speed. Very beautiful little gull with a forked tail. Notice the fork? That's the field mark. A bird which I wouldn't expect to find here, but again, I might say that birds do have wings and therefore anything is possible. They have been recorded on the Great Lakes. But this area really is most famous for its geese, and it should be a federal refuge. Now, it's very important to the future of the whole Pacific Flyway, to sportsmen in the western states and to bird watchers too, if they want to see geese in the future. Many sportsmen's organizations and many Audubon groups have made representation to the Department of Interior about this, but so far this has not been done. But we must make this into a refuge. I don't think the long-tailed Jaeger would eat young geese. This is a bird which is possible on the Great Lakes, but it's very rare, a natural thing. Now you'll notice the position of the bird in front with the neck close to the water. That's the female posture. The male has the aggressive posture. You can tell geese by the way they hold their necks very often, although their plumage is quite alike. They clambered ashore, but on the land they did have to worry about the Arctic fox. These babies are being escorted to the water by their parents. And these parents stick very close to the young. But the goose that I was most interested in was the emperor goose, a bird which I'd never seen before because normally it doesn't leave Alaska but stays there in the Arctic, migrates perhaps 200 or 300 miles to the warm waters around the base of the Aleutians. Here again they were hatching their young. Now I know Arthur Allen photographed the emperor goose on the nest, but I think this is the first time it's been photographed with young ones. It's becoming harder and harder as the years go on to get pictures that other photographers do not have. You have to go to the ends of the earth now to get new species. They're not going to let any glaucous gull get at their young ones. Eskimos have a very good sense of humor. I know Jack certainly had, and he thought it was the funniest thing he'd ever seen. Those two enormous men, Goodmanson and Fisher, surrounding one poor little duck in her brood. Now, Goodmanson actually stands 5'17". He's a very tall man. And Fisher is 5'13". But the reason they were so concerned about this little duck was because this was a bird which neither man had ever seen before. This was a spectacled eider. I'd never seen one either. So naturally we did want to make its acquaintance. Here again we noticed that the young ones kept very close to their mother's apron strings. The rule in the Arctic seems to be obey your mother or be eaten. Now, when we returned to the old church upriver, 4 broods of old squaws had hatched, including this one with 15 young. Now, when we showed Peter Scott this picture later, he said that he thought 2 broods were involved here. He says that it's rather well known that old squaws pool their broods at times. They can dive from the very first in deep water. Now watch this. Down, 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 down. It was with a great deal of regret that we left old Chivac at the end of a week, but we did have one more adventure ahead of us. And so when Jimmy Hoffman came in with a plane and brought it up on the mud, we said goodbye to Matty and to Jack, and we stowed our gear in the plane, and we took off, went back to Bethel, then took another plane to Anchorage, and at Anchorage we boarded one of the planes of the Revolution Airlines, the airline run by Bob Reeve, who runs the planes to the Pribilofs and to the Far Aleutians. At Cold Bay, not far from Dutch Harbor, we saw 2 or 3 of the big brown bears down below us, and the pilot dropped low and circled each bear so we could all see. Then we struck out over the ocean for 250 miles to the Pribilofs, to the north. We saw the Penguin, the Fish and Wildlife boat below us, and then as we came into St. Paul, a rare sight, we saw St. Paul in sunlight. Usually when the pilot comes in, he has to slip under the overcast. There had been 10 consecutive days of sun. That was very unusual and almost unheard of. And the Aleutes on the island were very upset about that. They said that much sun isn't good for people. They said last time we had that much sun was back in 1919, and everyone died of influenza. They were certain there was some connection. The flowers were out everywhere, and the sun did continue. And I was told the other day in Washington that they had as much sun that summer as they had had in the previous 30 years all put together. So as photographers, just think how lucky we were. I've known photographers to come here, spend as much as 6 weeks and never see the sun. So naturally we did get some photographic first here on the Pribilofs. We identified 100 species of flowers in the volcanic rocks around the island. There were only 4 kinds of passerine birds, or songbirds that is, nesting on the Pribilofs, and 1 sandpiper only. The Pribilof sandpiper, which is a very rare sandpiper, or perhaps I should say a little-known sandpiper because there are plenty of them here. It's just that these islands are so seldom visited by naturalists other than the fish and wildlife men. The eggs of the Pribilof sandpiper are very few in the museums of the world, and Dr. Goodmanson looked at these quite covetously. He wanted them for his museum in Iceland. But I, of course, was more concerned about the birds, getting their pictures, and I never could quite get over the idea that these were not redback sandpipers of some sort. They looked rather like redback sandpipers. Fisher had dreamed of visiting these islands for 30 years or more, ever since he was a small boy. Ever since he had read that wonderful story by Kipling, The White Seal, in the Jungle Book. Now he found that his dreams had come true. He saw all these birds that Kipling wrote about, all these wonderful colonies of seals. These, after all, are the Seal Islands. And many of these colonies still go by the old names they had when we took Alaska over. Names such as Zapadny Rookery, Tolstoy Rookery, Palavina, Novostashna. I don't know about my accent, but this is Novostashna, which is Northeast Rookery. That bull is trying to get through to the sea. He apparently is making an ill-starred attempt there. This bull is trying to keep his cows from running away. They apparently want out. And when he's not concerned with his own cows, he has to contend with the other bulls, who perhaps want more cows, constantly fighting. You'll notice the big hump on the back of the neck. Now, they live off the fat in that hump for 3 months, these big bulls do. They do not eat for 3 months. They come ashore, and they're so busy that they don't eat for 3 months. Now, this is a sultan, I would suspect, because he had 200 cows. The cows can come and go to the ocean, but they do have to run the gauntlet. Now, this cow seems to be nagging him about something. pulling the old man's whiskers. Usually when we found a little pup all by itself, a little pup like this one, we felt this wasn't normal. Either this pup had lost its mother or else it had hookworm. About 15% of them die of hookworm every year. The normal thing is to find the pups in great gangs, great creches like this. And the biologists tell us that each cow, when she comes from the sea once a week, finds her own pup. Out of 500,000 pups, she finds her own. Now this is a bull here that is acting as babysitter. It's not difficult to amuse the children if you know how. The 3-year-old pups, are the 3-year-old bulls, that is, are the ones that the Fish and Wildlife Service harvests every year for their furs. And $5 or $6 million turns over annually, of which $1 million is profit to our treasury. And over the years, more than double the purchase price of Alaska has been brought back to our treasury by these seals alone. And these are quite dangerous. They rush at you and you have to make a run for it once they get started because they can cover the ground. And Fisher had one very bad moment when a bull rushed him, an idle bull. He tripped over a rock and Fisher fell very heavily. The next thing he saw was this animal rushing towards him and this great face with whiskers looking down at him. And he thought, well, this is the end, or thought it was at least the end of part of him, because bulls have been known to bite big chunks out of people. Then, as he lay there, he noticed out of the corner of his eye that this bull just sort of sneered at him and walked away. And Fisher wondered about that. And he realized it was because this bull regarded him as vanquished. Fisher was down, and therefore, no point in following through. But this is what he saw, and he was absolutely terrified. Wonderful bird colonies, the like of which I've never seen before anywhere, not even in Scotland. I suspect these colonies in the Pribilofs are second only to the bird islands of Peru in numbers. Here were the same kittiwakes that we saw in Newfoundland, the black-legged kittiwakes, different subspecies, but the same species. And then these wonderful little red-legged kittiwakes. The bird on the left has the red legs. And those of us who are interested in biological things naturally wonder how it is that two species as similar as these two can live side by side, nest side by side as they often do, and still retain their identity, and apparently not compete too much. Probably, though, the redleg is a relict species, one that is losing out. You know, we have the competition between great automobiles like Ford, Chevrolet, and Studebaker and the others, and sooner or later one may drop out because of competition. It could be that this little redleg is a bird that is losing out in the world to the blackleg, because there are only about 2,000 individuals here in the Pribilofs. We very often had the feeling that we were being watched while we were watching the birds, and we'd turn around, we'd see the little Arctic fox. And these little foxes live off the bird colonies, but I don't think any real harm is done. It's well within the natural increase of the birds. They either lay again, in the case of eggs, or else... well, you'll notice they do not bother the cormorants. See the cormorant behind them? I used the camera gun for this shot, whereas I should have used a tripod for static shots such as this. But you can't always choose your weapons when you're in the field. The camera gun really is much better for flight shots, such as these which I'm taking of the tufted puffin. I usually would preset the distance, let the bird fly into focus, and hold it in the NIDAR gun sight, in the bullseye, then edit out those parts that were out of focus later. I wondered, as did Fisher, about these tufted puffins, why they have that very interesting head pattern, that golden hairdo, and all the red color on the beak. We like to think that everything in nature has some functional value, some survival value, but I don't know what it could be in the case of these birds. I doubt if it has much to do with food getting. These birds lose much of that, the bill coloration and the plumes in the wintertime. Therefore, I don't think it has much to do with food getting. It could be that it makes one bird more attractive to another. I don't know. But both male and female are quite similar, quite alike. This is a bird, another bird you wouldn't expect to find on the Great Lakes. But as I said before, birds do have wings, and everything is possible. Audubon, in fact, did find one off the coast of Maine in his day. And then there was this other puffin, a very interesting bird, the horned puffin, which looks quite like the familiar puffin of the Atlantic. In fact, I wish I had stripped in some of my Scottish footage so you could see the difference between the Atlantic puffin and this rare Arctic form. Now, the horned puffin has much more yellow at the base of the bill, and then these curious little horns above the eyes, which gives the bird a rather clown-like look, I suppose. Puffins belong to a great family of birds that we refer to often as the auks, the auk family, and the murres and the auklets belong to that family too. The Bering Sea must have been the place of origin of this great family, because we have only 6 kinds in the Atlantic, in the whole of the Atlantic. But of this great family, the tiniest is the least auklet, little fellow which is about the size of a starling, hardly looks like a seabird, but there were actually millions of them on St. George and St. Paul. The Aleutes call them chutskis. I think that's a rather appropriate name, chutski. They would fly up from the boulder fields like great flocks of starlings, hardly seemed like seabirds. And also tens of thousands of these little parakeet auklets, little fellows with red noses and white underparts, or as the Aleutes call them, Pribilofs. Now, as you can see by the feet, they do get their living from the water, but offhand I don't know whether they specialize in fish or copepods or perhaps mollusks. All that data is on file in Washington because many years ago there were a number of good stomach examinations made of these birds, but not recently. But I think this one was the most fantastic of the lot. I just didn't believe this bird. This was the crested auklet. Wouldn't you like to have that on the Detroit River? I believe one did turn up on a lake in Sweden many, many years ago. So, as I said before, birds do unpredictable things at times and do reach unusual places. But I wouldn't expect one of these pelagic birds to survive very long inland. But sometimes they get their direction wires crossed, and birds will turn up way away from their normal range. Now, I thought that I would have to return without ever getting pictures of these wonderful little fellows, because the first few days they didn't come to the rocks but flew over the ocean and just brushed the cliffs with their wings when they came in. They were scouting. But during the last 2 or 3 days they did come down, did allow me to take all the pictures I wanted. But of that great family of auks, I suppose the most numerous were the murres. We call them murres, and the British call them guillemots. They are the same, though, in both sides of the world. And wherever you looked, from the high cliffs, you'd see not just hundreds, not just thousands of these birds, but tens of thousands. In fact, at the harbor of St. George, I must have seen 1 million birds in sight at one time. Every nook, every cranny seemed to be occupied. Now, these birds fit the same niche in the Arctic that the penguins do in the Antarctic. And I think it's rather fortunate that they have the shape of penguins, because they certainly wouldn't fit on these rocks if they were shaped like ducks, would they? I think there's great survival value in that upright posture. But unlike the penguins, these birds have never lost the power of flight. In fact, they couldn't get up here if they couldn't fly. But there was one very wonderful colony on Walrus Island, 7 miles away, which had not been visited for at least 4 years, because the fogs usually prevent the landing. This was the first time in 4 years the penguin had been able to make a landing. And the group did want to. There was a visiting biologist from South Africa who was with us. And as we approached the island, the northern sea lions came out to greet us like a great welcoming committee. Now, these animals are twice the size of the little California sea lions we saw earlier, more than twice the size of the fur seals. Big, enormous beasts, which must be, at first they didn't seem to be too disturbed, but they hadn't seen people for about 4 years. But as we approached their rocks, they became more upset. They began to bellow and to roar, and then to porpoise out of the water. And for a few moments, we thought we were going to be swamped. Quite hectic at this point. It was bedlam, particularly when some of the big bulls started to jump in. And some of these big ones are really big. That one must weigh a ton. This one certainly does. The biologist, Ford Wilkie, who's leading the group, is the man in charge of the biological part of the fur seal work in Alaska. He wanted to make a survey of these sea lions. He found there were 4,000 of them here. Now, these do not have a commercial value as the fur seals do, although some of the fishermen complain they eat too many fish. But I do hope they will leave this island as a sanctuary to these wonderful animals. After all, the Bering Sea is so inexhaustible in its basic fish supply that not only 2 million fur seals can exist, but also many, many millions of birds, and also these animals. Probably the real show on Walrus is the great show of murres. This picture always reminds me of a lecture audience. Bill Cottrell said he didn't think there were more than 2 million, but of course he was guessing. So finally, Goodmanson and I took sample square yards, counted the birds in sample square yards, and then by taking the ship's charts and charting out the occupied parts of the island, we came up with a figure of about 1 million. I think that's right. That's still a lot of birds. There were certainly 1 million. And then there was one red-faced cormorant. I think his face really should have been red because he had that bit of seaweed and he was going through his courtship display with it, waving it about, going through all his bag of tricks, and I thought he was displaying to those murres, or perhaps to me. And then I noticed that there was another cormorant over there on the rocks. I presume it was a female, and I suppose he was, and he seemed to be directing his attentions to her, and he was showing her how many nests he could build and all that sort of thing. But I think it was a lost cause. Actually, there just wasn't room enough here for even one pair of cormorants. The other birds were always getting in the way. Well, now, before we close, we're going to go back to Northeast Rookery, where there was one little harem all by itself, which interested me greatly. The main rookery was outside the picture to the top, and while I had my lens focused on these, 2 big bulls started fighting in the big rookery outside the top of the picture, and while they had their backs turned, 5 cows made a run for it. 6 cows are going to come running in. And also 1 small pup. Now, just what the attraction was in this harem, I have no idea. But this bull didn't have to do a single thing. He didn't have to fight for, he got 6 more cows all at once. And I've never seen a more self-satisfied looking bull in all my life. He just sat there and gloated. So you see, even in a fur seal harem, life at times can be wonderful. And now with this big bull fur seal, we'll draw our tour around wild America to its close. I thank you.